The story begins not with a general, not with a decorated war hero surrounded by medals and prestige, but with a man whose name most people outside military history would never know. He was simply a captain, not a colonel, not a famous strategist, not a commander of great divisions, but a mid-level officer, responsible for the men under his command and for surviving a war that had already torn continents apart. Yet, this very man, through a mix of courage, sharp instinct, and the ability to see opportunity where others only saw certain death, would force an entire German battalion to surrender. His act would ripple through history, leaving Hitler himself in disbelief that something like this could even occur. To understand this extraordinary moment, we need to look closely at the captain himself. He was an American officer serving in the final months of World War II when the Allied forces were pushing deep into Europe, dismantling the remnants of the German war machine. By rank, he was nothing extraordinary. Captains were everywhere in the American Army, commanding companies, giving orders, carrying out missions. But unlike generals whose decisions shaped entire campaigns, captains lived closer to the ground. They ate the same rations as their men, marched in the mud, and risked the same sudden brutal death from enemy artillery or a sniper's bullet. This captain was not a man bred from privilege or destined from birth to be remembered in history books. He was the product of ordinary American life. Before the war, he might have been your neighbor, your teacher, or the man working in a small-town office. He did not seek out glory, and he certainly never imagined that one day he would face down hundreds of German soldiers almost entirely by himself. Yet the chaos of war has a way of placing ordinary people in impossible situations. What makes this man's story so powerful is not only the audacity of what he did, but the very fact that, by every measure of logic, he should never have succeeded. Germany in 1945 was desperate, but its forces were still dangerous. Even retreating units of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS had discipline, firepower, and a will to fight. The Allied soldiers knew this well. Any encounter with an organized German force was dangerous. For a single officer to confront a battalion was suicide. But this captain's personality held something rare. He was calm under pressure, unwilling to be consumed by fear, even when staring at impossible odds. He understood the psychology of war, that often the appearance of confidence, the suggestion of overwhelming force, could be more powerful than bullets. This was not a man of arrogance, but of calculation. Every decision he made in that critical moment would be built on his ability to see through the fear and act with boldness when others might freeze. By this stage of the war, the German military was fractured. Many battalions were cut off from higher command, struggling to regroup, retreat, or simply survive. Soldiers were exhausted, supplies were low, and morale had begun to crumble after years of grinding losses on every front. Hitler's promises of victory rang hollow, and the once unstoppable Wehrmacht was now reduced to fragmented units scattered across collapsing fronts. And yet, despite this decline, German forces still posed lethal threats. A single battalion, even weakened, represented hundreds of soldiers armed with machine guns, mortars, and rifles. To face them required not only bravery, but an almost reckless willingness to bluff against death itself. This is where the captain's story begins to reveal its extraordinary weight. He was not backed by an armored division. He did not have artillery support pounding the enemy from a distance. He was not surrounded by waves of infantry ready to storm German positions. He was essentially alone, separated from his unit, moving through enemy territory at a time when a single wrong step meant capture or execution. He had no guarantee that his side would even know what happened to him if he vanished. In the ordinary course of war, such an isolated officer might have been written off as another tragic casualty of the final push into Germany. Yet something in his character made him refuse to accept that fate. Accounts of his actions reveal a man who could think quickly, who could weigh risk against opportunity, and who believed that projecting strength when he had almost none was the only way to survive. He was not reckless for the sake of heroics. He was practical, but his practicality operated on a razor's edge. In those final months of the war, many American soldiers were weary, homesick, and simply trying to survive long enough to see victory declared. The captain could have done the same. He could have hidden, avoided confrontation, and waited for reinforcements. No one would have judged him for that. But instead, He stepped directly into the jaws of danger, driven by a conviction that boldness could change the outcome. To the men who later learned of his actions, it seemed almost impossible that such courage could come from someone so unassuming. But this is the paradox of war. History often turns not on the celebrated figures whose names dominate textbooks, but on the quiet determination of individuals who, in a single critical moment, make decisions that ripple outward in ways they never intended. This captain embodied that paradox. He had not trained for this specific scenario. No military manual had prepared him for the idea of standing against a battalion. Yet, shaped by the hardship of years in the army, by the long marches, the cold nights, the constant danger, he had developed a resilience that now became his most powerful weapon. As he walked forward, carrying only the authority of his rank and the calm steel of his presence, he was about to gamble everything on one truth: that fear works both ways. The Germans were men too tired, uncertain, and afraid of annihilation. If he could convince them that resistance was futile, if he could appear to be the tip of a much larger force hidden just beyond the trees, then perhaps, just perhaps, they would yield. This is what separates ordinary courage from the extraordinary. It is not merely the willingness to face danger, but the ability to seize control of the enemy's mind, to bend their perception, and to make them believe what is not there. This captain would soon do exactly that. But at this point in the story, as he first approached, he remained only one man in uniform, with a sidearm and a determination that seemed almost reckless. He was the lone captain, the quiet officer who had not been destined for glory, now stepping into the impossible role that history demanded of him. The air around him was heavy with tension, the knowledge that at any second, one German soldier could raise his rifle and end the entire gamble. Yet, he did not flinch. He carried himself with the authority of someone who knew reinforcements must be behind him, even though none were. Every step was a test of nerves, a performance played out on the razor's edge of life and death, and though no one knew it yet, this simple, almost anonymous captain was about to force an entire battalion of the Wehrmacht to lay down its arms. For Hitler, the news would be more than a defeat. It would be humiliation, a symbol of how far the Reich had fallen. But for now, in this moment, all that mattered was the lone figure of one captain walking forward into history, unarmed with anything except his resolve and the daring belief that the impossible could be made real. The captain's steps toward the German lines marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary confrontations of the war. Imagine the scene. One American officer, armed only with a pistol in his uniform, walking with steady confidence into the presence of an entire German battalion. Behind him, there were no columns of tanks rumbling through the fields, no artillery barrages shaking the ground, no squads of riflemen creeping through the trees. It was only him. Yet the way he carried himself told another story. His stride did not suggest weakness or isolation. It radiated command, as though invisible forces marched in step with him, hidden by the terrain, waiting for his signal. The Germans watched, puzzled. This officer did not look like a man lost or frightened. He looked like a messenger of inevitability. They could not yet know that he was bluffing with everything he had. The situation was tense beyond measure. One wrong move, one nervous trigger pull, and the moment would collapse into chaos. Hundreds of rifles could open fire in an instant, cutting the captain down. He knew this, but he also knew that fear was a universal language. If he showed even a flicker of hesitation, the Germans would smell weakness. But if he stood tall, if his voice carried authority, he could plant doubt in their minds. Doubt could grow faster than any bullet could travel. As he came closer, the German officers stepped forward. They were wary but curious. Who was this lone man who dared approach without a white flag, without surrender, without backup? Was he insane, or did he know something they did not? The captain greeted them with calm firmness. His words were simple, direct, and sharp as steel. He told them that resistance was useless, that they were surrounded by overwhelming American forces, and that their only option was to surrender immediately. His tone carried no hint of negotiation. It was not a request, it was an order. The German officers exchanged glances. Could this be true? The battalion was exhausted, cut off, running low on supplies. Rumors had spread that American armored divisions were sweeping the countryside. The Reich was collapsing, and every soldier knew it. But surrendering to one man? That was unthinkable. Unless, of course, he was not truly alone. The captain's genius lay in the performance. He never broke character. He spoke as though his words were backed by invisible armies. Every pause, every command, every gesture suggested that hundreds of American rifles were trained on the Germans from the shadows. He projected the certainty of someone who held all the cards. The German officers felt the weight of his confidence pressing on them. Their soldiers, tired and afraid, looked for guidance. None of them wanted to be the first to fire, the first to trigger the storm that could annihilate them. Psychology became the captain's most powerful weapon. War is not only fought with bullets, it is fought in the mind. He understood this truth better than most. By convincing the Germans that they had no chance, he stripped away their will to resist. His words painted a picture of doom. Artillery ready to blast them apart, tanks waiting to crush their lines, infantry prepared to storm their positions. None of it existed, but in the fog of war, perception mattered more than reality. The standoff grew heavier with every passing second. The German commander tried to gauge the truth. His men were hungry, their morale shattered, and their maps showed little hope of reinforcement. If the captain was telling the truth, resistance meant certain death. If he was lying, then perhaps they could still fight their way out. But was it worth the gamble? To order resistance could mean not only his own death, but the destruction of every man under his command. The captain pressed the advantage. He did not plead, he did not shout. He maintained the steady tone of inevitability, repeating that the battalion was surrounded and that further resistance would be suicidal. He warned that American artillery would rain down in minutes if they refused. His voice never wavered and his eyes never shifted. The Germans began to feel the weight of invisible enemies surrounding them, enemies conjured entirely by the captain's courage. The silence of the forest was a weapon in itself. The Germans strained to hear movement beyond the trees, to spot shadows of American troops. The captain knew that hesitation was on his side. Every moment they delayed was another moment of doubt sinking deeper into their minds. Soldiers who were already exhausted, already afraid, now had to wrestle with the possibility that they were outnumbered and surrounded. Their will to resist weakened with every heartbeat. Some of the German soldiers lowered their weapons slightly. The officers hesitated. No one dared to call the bluff outright. The captain saw it, and he pressed harder. He gave them a choice: surrender with dignity or face annihilation. His words cut through the silence like a blade. He spoke as though he held their fates in his hands, and in a way, he did. The impossible encounter had become a battle of nerves, and the Germans were losing. The weight of years of war, the hopelessness of fighting for a collapsing Reich, the fear of invisible American firepower, all of it converged in this one moment. One lone American captain had bent the will of hundreds of enemy soldiers without firing a shot. The Germans began to realize that even if he was bluffing, they could not afford to gamble against him. For the captain, every second was a knife edge. He knew that if even one German officer decided to test him, to call for a shot, the illusion would shatter instantly. His life hung on the fragile thread of performance, yet he showed no fear. He embodied the presence of an entire army, standing alone but commanding as though thousands backed him. What makes this encounter so extraordinary is how close it balanced between triumph and disaster. The Germans could have killed him in an instant, yet his gamble paid off because he understood that war is as much about perception as it is about firepower. By playing on the enemy's exhaustion and fear, by magnifying their doubts, he turned weakness into strength. When historians look back at the great battles of World War II, they often focus on tanks, divisions, and generals. But here, in this forest clearing, history was decided by psychology. One man's ability to project strength created the illusion of overwhelming force. Against all logic, a single captain stood face to face with a battalion and made them hesitate long enough to believe defeat was inevitable. This moment was not about weapons. It was about willpower. It was about nerve. The German officers, realizing the risk, began to consider surrender. Their pride resisted, but reality pressed down. To resist could mean annihilation. To surrender to one man might sting, but it would save lives. And so, the unthinkable began to take shape. The battalion, disciplined and armed, started to waver under the pressure of a captain who should have been powerless, but instead had complete control of the encounter. The impossible had become possible. The captain had taken a gamble that few would ever dare, and against all odds, he had forced the enemy into the one decision that no one in Berlin could have imagined: surrender. The silence broke not with gunfire, but with the sound of surrender. The German officers, their faces heavy with the weight of impossible choices, finally gave the signal. Slowly, carefully, the soldiers began to lower their rifles. One after another, weapons clattered to the ground, a chorus of steel on dirt that echoed louder than any cannon. The captain had done it. A single man, without reinforcements, without artillery, without tanks, had compelled an entire battalion to lay down its arms. It was a moment almost beyond belief, a living contradiction of everything war had taught up to that point. Armies were supposed to yield only to greater armies, but here, in this clearing, a lone captain had achieved what entire divisions sometimes could not: the unconditional surrender of hundreds of enemy troops. The Germans stood in rows, disarmed, their heads lowered. They were not cowards. They were soldiers who had fought hard across Europe, soldiers trained to obey, to endure, to die if necessary. Yet, in this instant, they chose life. And they chose it because the American captain had convinced them that resistance was futile. He had taken their fear and amplified it, turned it into the decisive factor that broke their will. The German commander approached the captain, offering formal surrender. For the captain, it was almost surreal. He was one man, but now he stood as the master of hundreds. In their eyes, he was not a simple captain anymore. He was the embodiment of American power, the living proof that the war was lost. The practical problem immediately became clear. What does one man do with an entire battalion of prisoners? He could not guard them. He could not march them alone. But the German officers, desperate to maintain order, followed his commands. They organized their men. They kept discipline, and in an astonishing reversal of roles, they took instructions from the very man who had tricked them into surrendering. The captain ordered them to march toward American lines, and they obeyed. It was a bizarre procession. One American officer leading hundreds of disarmed Germans, a single figure at the head of a column that should have swallowed him whole. Yet the illusion held. The Germans still believed that any attempt to resist would bring disaster. The bluff had grown into reality. When the captain's fellow Americans first saw the column approaching, they could hardly believe their eyes. At first, some thought it was a German attack, that the enemy was advancing in force, but then they noticed the rifles slung over shoulders, the lack of resistance, the single American officer at the front. The truth hit them. Their captain had done the impossible. He had captured an entire battalion on his own. Soldiers rushed to secure the prisoners, still struggling to process what they were witnessing. It became one of those stories that spread like wildfire through the ranks, retold with disbelief and admiration. Word eventually reached higher command. The idea that one captain could compel such a surrender was almost too much to accept. Reports were checked, rechecked, and confirmed. Yes, it was true. Hundreds of Germans had surrendered because of one man's audacity. For Hitler, the news was a humiliation beyond measure. The Führer had spent years building the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht, the unstoppable storm that would crush all enemies. Now, in the final months of the war, that myth was shattered not only by Allied armies, but by the audacity of one American captain. If a battalion could surrender to a single man, what faith could Germans have in their leader's promises of victory? It was a symbol of collapse, a living metaphor for the crumbling Reich. The surrender had immense symbolic power. It showed that the German army was no longer the force it once had been. Exhausted, demoralized, cut off from hope, its soldiers could be made to lay down their arms by the sheer force of confidence and psychology. For the Allies, it was proof that the war was in its final chapter. The German machine was breaking apart, not just physically, but mentally. Even the presence of one determined opponent could now unravel entire formations. But beyond the symbolism, there was the human reality. Hundreds of German soldiers had been spared death. They would spend the remainder of the war as prisoners rather than corpses on the battlefield. The captain, by bluffing them into surrender, had saved lives, not only his own, but those of his men who might have had to fight that battalion head-on. The encounter was not just a triumph of courage, it was also a triumph of humanity. A firefight would have meant blood, chaos, and loss. Instead, one man's nerve turned it into an orderly surrender. The story spread across the front, becoming part of the folklore of the war. Soldiers told it with awe, how their captain had walked alone into the lion's den and walked back out with the lion on a leash. It was the kind of tale that lifted morale, that reminded every soldier that victory was possible even in the darkest hours. And yet, the captain himself never sought glory. He had acted not for fame, but for survival and duty. He understood that he had bluffed, that chance had played its part, but he also knew that in war, outcomes mattered more than the methods. The fact remained, he had forced a battalion to surrender. Historians would later analyze the event, trying to explain how it could have happened. They pointed to the collapse of German morale, the exhaustion of the troops, the confusion of the late war. They explained it through logistics, psychology, and timing, but explanations could never fully capture the raw reality of that moment, one man standing against hundreds and winning. It was a reminder that history is not always written by armies alone. Sometimes it pivots on the actions of a single individual whose courage bends the course of events. For Hitler, the surrender was more than an embarrassment. It was a crack in the facade of power. If the German people had known that entire battalions were giving up to single captains, faith in the war would have evaporated even faster. The Nazi propaganda machine tried to suppress stories like this, but the truth circulated among soldiers, gnawing at their confidence. Every rumor of surrender, every whisper of collapse made it harder for them to keep fighting. The Reich was bleeding not only from Allied bombs and bullets, but from within, from the erosion of its soldiers' will to resist. The captain's act became a symbol of the war's turning point. It was not a great battle with maps and strategies, not a clash of tanks and aircraft. It was a confrontation of wills, won by the calm audacity of a single man. And in that victory lay the larger truth of the Allied advance, that the German army, once feared across the world, was no longer invincible. In the years after the war, stories like this continued to inspire. They reminded people that courage was not the property of generals alone, that sometimes the most decisive acts came from ordinary officers, from men who refused to give in to fear. The captain who had walked into the impossible encounter and emerged with a battalion in tow stood as proof of that. He was not a man of legend, not someone seeking glory. He was simply a soldier doing his duty, who happened to find himself in a moment where his nerve changed everything. A battalion surrendered that day, but in truth, something greater surrendered as well. The myth of German invincibility collapsed, and Hitler himself was left in shock. For him, it was a humiliation that cut deep, a symbol of the Reich's unraveling. For the Allies, it was a triumph of will over force, of courage over numbers. And for history, it became one of those rare moments that show how, even in the vast machinery of war, the decision of a single man can echo louder than armies. The image remains unforgettable. One captain, walking tall, his uniform dusty, his pistol at his side, leading hundreds of disarmed enemies down the road to captivity. No shots fired, no bodies fallen, just the silent march of men who had once believed themselves the masters of Europe, now surrendering to the resolve of one man. It was the war in miniature. A mighty empire crumbling under the pressure of will, collapsing not with thunder, but with the quiet sound of weapons laid down. This was not only a military victory, it was a moral one. It proved that wars are not only decided by machines and numbers, but by human spirit, by the ability of individuals to seize the moment and change everything. The captain had no guarantee of survival when he approached that battalion, but by acting with boldness when logic said it was suicide, he achieved the unthinkable. One man compelled hundreds to surrender, and in doing so, he left behind a story so unbelievable, so dramatic, that even Adolf Hitler could not mask his shock. It was the humiliation of the Reich, the triumph of one captain, and the symbol of a world finally breaking free from tyranny.